Create a video to go over painting tips using your color wheel template as an example. So I've gathered all my supplies together. I've got my paint palette here. I've got my paintbrush. And for this assignment, I'm using something a little smaller. This is a size 8 because my spaces are relatively small, okay? I'm also using a flat brush, not a round brush. I went ahead and got a palette knife for blending colors, which you may or may not have. It's not required, but I wanted to show you how to use it. I've got my water basin. You could use any cup, jar, bowl, doesn't matter, for water, but I like this because it's got 2 sides, one that I can keep dirty and one that I can keep clean. I have my acrylics. I just grabbed a red, a yellow. It's going to show you how to mix colors, and then I was going to show you tints and shades as well, so I went ahead and grabbed a black and a white. And lastly, I have some paper towels. Okay, you're going to need this for blotting, for drying off your brush. If you make a mistake, you can pull this back out just like you could with watercolor. So these are all of my supplies. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my palette. Now remember, you can use a paper plate at home. That's perfectly fine. But you want to separate your paints. Okay. So I'll put some red. And then we'll put a little bit of yellow here. And then I'll spread this out. I'll put black on one side and white on the other. Okay. In the middle of my palette is where I'll do my color mixing. So we're going to start, I'm just going to start with red, okay? So I want to load my brush with some red paint, okay? You can see my brush is nice and loaded with red. Put my palette to the side. Then remember that you want to choke up on your brush, right? We're not conducting the symphony. Hold your brush pretty much as you would your pencil or your pen, okay? For control, I like to use my pinky when I need stability. Put my wrist down, flatten out your brush along that edge. We're going to work on brush control as well as color mixing. And then I'll just pull in nice long strokes. I want to make sure that my coverage is nice and even. Okay. Go in one direction. And remember, one of the nice things about acrylics is that if you do mess up, once it's dry, you just paint right over it. So don't be afraid, don't be intimidated. If the coverage is not even or opaque enough, once it's dry, just give it another layer. We do want it to be nice and smooth and even. At the end of the day, we'd like not to see any visible brush strokes. Okay. Now, when it comes to we're getting down here to the smaller area. If you wanted to switch to a smaller brush, that's fine. Or you can just, like I'm doing, switch to the side of the brush. So I have some control. Okay. Or like I said, you can switch to a smaller flat, or even in that instance, a round brush. Okay. Now, where my coverage is uneven, because I was running out of paint, go back to my palette, add some more paint, make sure I'm still going in the same direction. Notice I'm taking my time, I'm going slowly. All right, I'm not in a big hurry. Flatten out those bristles. Switch to the side when I get down here. Okay, craftsmanship is going to be important. because we're going to be creating what's known as a hard-edged acrylic painting. So at the end of the day, we'd like for those brush strokes to disappear. Now remember, this is going to dry darker than it appears. So just be forewarned about that. Over here, I'm going to clean my brush. And then I'm going to dry it with my paper towels. Okay. And now let's go to the yellow. I'm going to load my paintbrush once again. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to do the same thing with my yellow. Okay. Now I'm not going to take the time to finish this whole thing out because I do want to show you how to mix your colors. Just remember, same process. Long strokes, flatten out your bristles, let your hand or your pinky steady you when needed. Make sure you've got nice, opaque, smooth paint coverage. Okay, it's kind of hard to see all of that yellow. All right, so now let's say you've only got the primary colors. What are you going to do to fill in with your intermediates and your secondaries? You're going to have to mix, right? So remember, I've got my primaries here. I've got my red and my yellow. I'm going to move this out of the way for a second. Now, I want to mix to make orange, okay? So I'm going to start with my lighter color. I'm going to grab some yellow, put it out here. I'm going to grab some red. You always want to mix the darker color into the lighter color. Why? Because it's easier to get darker than it is to get lighter. I'll have to use a lot more yellow. Used a little bit too much red. You see that? I have to use a lot more yellow to make the red lighter than I need red to make the yellow darker. Okay, now see my palette knife is helping me to blend those two colors together. And I'm getting an orange. Okay, right now it's a little more like a red-orange. Which is fine because I need to paint red-orange on my color wheel also. So I could stop here for right now with my palette knife. And I'll just use that red-orange and then make that a little bit lighter to make my orange. So load my brush with that paint, right? Okay. Find my red-orange. I'm trying not to get my hands in this since I've got wet paint. And I apply my red-orange. Okay. Now to lighten that up, I just continue adding some yellow. See, it's getting lighter until I make my orange. Now, you can do this with your paintbrush. Just be sure if you're using your paintbrush that the paint is entirely mixed together before you paint, because sometimes you'll think it is, and then you go to paint and you've got these streaks that show up where it's not fully blended. Okay, that's why the palette knife is kind of nice to use. Some people also like to paint with the palette knife, especially if you wanted to create texture, impasto, which is a really thick texture. Okay, so now I'm starting to get that nice orange. All right, now the other thing I wanted to show you was making tints and shades, because eventually you will need to do that for your paintings. Same process. You always want to put the darker color into the lighter color. So I've got my orange, my red orange here. I just need a little bit of black, right? A little bit of black. Here, I'll mix it with the paintbrush to show you. A little black goes a long way. It's a strong color, and we don't need a ton in order to make a shade of that color. And you see what I'm talking about? See how I started to paint, it's not entirely mixed together. So you just need to be conscious of that. All right, so then I've got my shade going over here. It's a darker. So when it comes to making your painting, we are going to choose a color scheme. We're going to talk about that in class. You will need to have tints and shades of the colors in your color scheme in your painting. Okay, and then you just make sure that that's nice and thoroughly mixed together. Okay. Now for a tint, it's just the opposite. So I'm going to start with some white. Just scoop that up, put it over here on my palette. And then I'm going to take a little bit of the color and add that to my white, because the white is the lighter value, the lighter color. Mix that up, and now I'm making a tint of my orange. Make sure it's thoroughly blended. See how it's not thoroughly blended with my paintbrush. So you just really need to make sure that you spend some time blending that paint together if you're not using a palette knife. Okay. So I've got the pure hue that I mixed here. I've got a shade here, the color plus black, and I've got a tint here, the color plus white. Okay. Make sure at the end of your painting session you really thoroughly clean and dry your brushes, because remember, the acrylics will ruin them, they'll stain. So it might take a couple swipes. Rinse my palette knife as well. Look at how dirty my water is. So I can use this water for cleaning and this water here if I needed to dilute my colors. Let me show you that. Let's say I wanted to do a wash and I wanted to thin this paint down. I just mix it with some water. Okay, so it becomes a lot thinner. And of course, once your water gets really murky and dirty, you'll want to go dump that and get some clean water. See, I clean my brush here, and then I can use my clean water to continue to dilute my paint so that I can paint in light layers or washes, you know, just as I was doing or would do if this were watercolor. Okay. The last thing to remember, I've mentioned this in class, is let's say, you know, I'm out of time, but I've got a lot of paint here that I want to preserve for my next painting session. I will cover this with a damp paper towel, and then I can just wrap it airtight with saran wrap, and then it'll last, you know, from maybe one painting session to the next. It's not going to last for days and days and days. You will eventually have to wash this. If I left this like this is going to harden, and it'll be like plastic, like peeling it off like plastic. So you want to make sure you wash all of your materials if they're reusable. If you're using a paper plate, obviously you can just toss that, right? Because you're not going to want to reuse that. Hope this is helpful. If you have questions, just, you know, reach out to me. And I'm not going to have time to go over this in class. Remember, I won't be in class. There will be no Zoom on Friday, but we'll be talking about this stuff as you guys start to paint. And as questions arise, you know, just bring them to me.